Hey friends, so today I'm going to be doing another video that's very similar to the how to be fascinated with your existence one. And if you haven't seen that, I'll put a link to that in the description. But that makes me so happy because I love making these types of videos, even though I love the other ones too. But the interesting perspective videos are the videos where I can kind of piece together a little bit of how I see reality, I think are really cool. And I think they're super valuable too, because if you're existing, then they're applicable, right? So, you can be running or talking to somebody or laying in bed or whatever, but there's still an environment around you that has complex interactions that have implications if you consider them in a certain way, if you have a certain perspective. And a lot of these implications, for me, lead me to a state of fascination and awe and wonder, but ultimately to gratitude and appreciation. And the more types of perspectives that you can take that ultimately lead you to gratitude and appreciation, you're going to spend a lot more time in that state. And that's very valuable for me. I take a lot of solace in just being very, very grateful and appreciative of whatever environment I'm in. And I feel personally like sharing these types of perspectives may help other people, hopefully you, adopt that type of gratitude-centric or appreciation-centric mentality. And it's a great place to live. So yeah, the argument I'm going to try to make today is much more ambitious than the previous argument about, or the previous video about how to be fascinated with your existence. And because of such, I'm going to probably have this either be a longer video or split it up, but I have a feeling it's just going to be a longer video. And the argument is that consciousness is not generated by the brain. It's not local to my brain. It's not local to your brain, and that it exists everywhere. And that part two of the argument is that it's likely it may be the only thing that exists. But we'll get there. And I'm going to make this argument from a left brain approach. I'm not going to appeal to spirituality. I'm not going to appeal to religion or anything like that. Because if I had to convince myself of this argument, I would be way more receptive to the left brain rhetoric, the analytical, the skeptic approach, than the appeal to authority in the form of religion or spirituality. So, kind of diving. Well, actually, there's one more thing I want to talk about before I start. And so, consciousness is something that's not understood, right? And I make no claims to have a good understanding of it. And the reason that's important is because the way that science evolves, the way that human knowledge evolves, is there's a phenomena that's not understood. In this case, consciousness, but there's a phenomena that's not understood, and a bunch of theories are presented from different individuals to help explain this phenomenon. And the ones that do a good job outcompete the ones that do a bad job, and the ones that do a simple good job in a simple nature outcompete the ones that do a good job in a complex nature. And then eventually the ones that do a good job in a simple nature and can connect very seamlessly into a bunch of other models of reality, if you will, they're the ones that are generally accepted and the ones that stick around. So these theories compete a lot like life competes for survival. And I bring this up because consciousness is an unknown phenomena, and by listening all the way through to the theory about consciousness not being generated by the brain, which feels very foreign at first, by the way, and I understand that, does account for a lot of variables outside of just consciousness and the human experience that kind of don't fit the current mold of understanding or scientific understanding. And so because this theory can bridge the gap between a lot of different things, and I think makes a lot of sense even from just a strict observational standpoint, which I'll go into, I think it's a good theory, and I'm hoping that you have an open mind and are willing to listen to the entirety of the theory, even if it's a little longer. Because I think ultimately it's a good thing. It'll make you feel happy. So yeah, one of the most important things to understand when considering this is the limitations of our own awareness, the limitations of our own consciousness. And that's a really kind of hard question to tackle, right? But a good way to do it is through education and understanding how our experience kind of was molded by life, how we evolved, so to speak. And so another link I'll put in the description is a link to something called the RNA world hypothesis. Now, the RNA world hypothesis is fantastic. It is a very, very well done video. It's 7 minutes long, totally worth your time, especially if RNA is something you heard in biology and then you just forgot it, or it's just a foreign concept to you. I'll go into it a little bit, but I'm trying to keep this video and cut it down in length. so I'm not going to go into it too much. But so essentially, RNA is an acid, ribonucleic acid, and it would have been an acid that was more than likely being produced by Earth's chemistry, geochemistry, in abundance during the early stages of the planet. And this acid is very interesting and very unique. It's made up of two different parts, so it's got a backbone that can connect to any other acid molecule, doesn't matter, and it's got a vertical part, or a nucleotide, that can be one of four types, and so that's A, C, U, and G, but for this video I'm just going to say A, B, C, and D, okay? Now, an interesting thing is that chains of these molecules via the backbone can create, and so this is like an acid chain, that's what I mean when I say chain. And these chains can have random sequences of these nucleotides, random A, B, C, Ds, doesn't matter. And an interesting component of RNA is that it's got two different ways of connecting to another molecule. So you can connect to any other molecule via the backbone, but you can also have nucleotides pair up to one another through a process called base pairing. And so a visualization might be a capital T, right? So this part would be the backbone that can connect to anything else, and this part's the nucleotide that can only connect to a specific other nucleotide. And so a way of thinking about this is that, A, B, C, D, A and B only pair up, and C and D only pair up. A can never pair to C, A can never pair to B, to D, and vice versa, and all the types of combinations. So A and B are a pair, and C and D are a pair. And so, you have this acid chain, and should it have the proper chain, just by random, it can self-base pair, so it can fold up on itself and pair to itself. And depending on what the sequence is, certain pairs, certain chains can fold up and pair into a ribozyme, which is kind of like a catalyst that has a function that can do things. And one of the most amazing functions that can happen randomly, and this is shown in the video, is that RNA chains can create catalyst-like structures called ribozymes that can actually make more RNA, which is nuts. That's so cool that you have an acid that is interacting with its environment to make more of itself, to make more of that acid. And that's amazing. So if you were to think about a pool of RNA with these ribozymes in it that can actually make other nucleotides, that pool is going to have access to way more nucleotides than a pool that doesn't have these ribozymes, right? That doesn't have these nucleotide building catalysts. And because of that, during a process of self-replication, which the video will cover, I'm not going to go into that. It's just by base pairing though, and it's one of the things that actually we don't fully understand how it could happen. We believe it could happen very easily, but no matter what the theory is, it's going to be very reminiscent of this ribozyme-centric theory, which is whether you have proto-RNA or this type of RNA or whatever RNA that eventually leads to ribozyme-building strands. That's where the starting point is. So I know I took a little caveat there, but at any rate, if this pool that has ribozymes that can build nucleotides has way more nucleotides in it, which means that there's way more base pair replication occurring. And that's really the first kind of form of competitive life, where you have different efficiency building nucleotides, and the ones that are more efficient have access to more nucleotides because they're more efficient, so they replicate more, and so eventually they spread out and they dominate the environment. And then other types of traits can develop too. Like, let's say that you have a trait of cutting, snipping another strand, and so that strand is no longer consuming the nucleotides, if you want to think of nucleotides as food for replication, because of that, the snipper have access to more nucleotides, so that trait will spread out, and shields will spread out, and all these traits will spread out. And so that's really the first form of Darwinistic competition in life, which is pretty cool. And the reason I bring this up is because, not only because it's really cool, but because understanding kind of where life started from an observational view, from a scientific or a non-spiritual view, is really great in understanding the baseline objective of our senses, of our sense data, of our awareness, of our consciousness, if that was evolutionarily evolved, which we're going to take the stance that it was, because that's the skeptic's approach. So that being said, let's say that, our sense data plays a huge role in our consciousness, a huge role, right? So what I see and what I hear and what I feel, that has a big effect on my experience, my awareness, my consciousness. And so, just taking our eyes, like the way that eyes evolved, is there were, little tiny organisms and microorganisms that used photosynthesis for energy. And one mistake that spread out was a flagellum. It's a little tiny nub or tail. And the reason that spread out is because the the energy of having mobility, right? So the organism has to put energy into having mobility, to fueling that mistake, was less than the energy that it got out of having mobility, right? So being mobile let you move towards food sources or move away from competition or dangerous environments. And so it was a useful trait that, because it was useful, the organism spread out, or excuse me, survived longer. And so it duplicated more and spread out. And eventually, just by mistake, there was a photoreactive component to this flagellum, right? So it was a flat, like, photoreactive cell or organelle or something to this flagellum. And so why it was beneficial is because if light hit this, the flagellum would go. And so now you're swimming towards your food source, which is so beneficial, right? And it's not like you intend, that's not like the microorganism intended, it's like, oh, I want to be able to swim to my food source, but a helpful mistake did that. And so because that was so useful, it spread out. And then another mistake occurred, and so instead of it being like a flat receptor, it was a concave receptor. And so now you have a much better idea of where light's coming from. Very useful. And then if that were to happen again and again and again over millions of years, eventually you get a structure that looks a lot like an eye, this being an iris. And in like the Nautilus case, that's where it ended. You could stick your finger into a Nautilus eye. Don't do that, but you could. And then, with animals, because I'm talking about our experience, our evolution, a film developed over that eye, and why that was beneficial is because, once you have this great interactor with reality, these great set of eyes, you can do a lot of other processes like food foraging or mate foraging or whatever off of it. And if you lose it, well, now you're kind of screwed. And so the adaptation of not losing it, right, by not getting infection or anything, was very valuable because it helped us survive more, hence procreate more, etc. And then, it filled with interocular fluid, and that aided in the clarity of the picture, which helped us hunt, visual acuity, stuff like that. And so that stuck around. And so, your eyes were carved out of the woodwork, if you will, by mistake, and because it aids you in interacting with reality, interfacing with reality. Now that's important. Same thing with your other senses. Your ears only hear a specific decibel range. Your eyes only see 10 to the negative 7th. That's the wavelength that, the sun really emits. But other animals' eyes, other animals' interfaces, if you want to think of it that way, have a different view. Like a mantis shrimp has a really, I think, one of the best, if not the best eyes in the animal kingdom. It can see the biggest spectrum. And a bat's eyes are obviously awful. But a bat's ears are really good. And so, they can hear, or they can echolocate. I don't know if they can necessarily hear a larger decibel range or not. But at any rate, your eyes, your ears, your sense data gives you a small snippet of reality, even though it's a really useful snippet for your organism and for your RNA, and in our case DNA, to survive. It's still just a snippet of reality. And it's a representation too. And so moving on to dot 2 of information, if you want to think of it this way, it's really easy to look at that chair or look at this cup or look at or hear a certain sound and really feel like, okay, that's actually happening. That's actually happening. I'm here. I feel it. I see it. I'm experiencing it. And without going off the deep end, so to speak, it's a good assumption because it makes sense for your RNA to feel that way. It makes sense for your organism, your animal to feel that way. But really what's happening is it's a model inside of your own head, being generated inside of your own head, that your awareness is interacting with. And so what I mean is, light bounces off that chair and hits my eye, goes through rods and cones, stimulates my optic nerve, goes to my occipital lobe. My occipital lobe translates it, and that's how I see. And that's inside of my head. Same thing with my ears. A sound wave will hit my eardrum that will ripple, which will cause movements in the 3 most tiny bones in the human body. They will work together. These bones will work together to stimulate, your auditory nerve, which goes to your temporal lobe, and then that gets translated into sound as you and I hear it. So the brain is a translator. It interprets input data, and it makes. But and this is interesting, and this is kind of where I'm heading to, is although that is the case, right? So although your awareness is interacting with a model inside of your own head, there's no point inside of your own head neuroanatomically where everything comes together. It's a real mystery in the medical community. It's something that we as in the scientific community has been kind of baffled by forever. We have a great idea of what parts of the brain do what, but it's totally decentralized. There's never one point where everything comes together. And why that's so interesting is that, I definitely feel like I have one homogeneous experience. I'm seeing while I'm hearing, while I'm feeling, while I'm thinking, etc. And if you're anything like me, you probably feel that way too. You feel like things are happening. There's a congruent, your awareness kind of ties together all of this different data that's coming together, which is obviously super beneficial. And again, I don't want to beat this point into the dust, but that's really important to understand, is that there's no point neuroanatomically where everything comes together. And so this kind of homogeneous feeling creates this easy medical fallacy that, the brain ties everything together because I feel like everything ties together. But we have no medical evidence of that. Everything is decentralized. And that's really important to kind of consider. So not only is our perceptions a non-holistic view of reality, right? We're only getting an interface with reality that has been kind of forged out over a long, long time to aid just RNA. You don't need to see the truth. You need to see what's beneficial for you to see, So that's an important concept. So our senses are totally flawed. There's no evidence neuroanatomically that the brain brings everything together and ties it together and say, oh, that points your awareness. And what's more is, like, not only have we not been able to understand how that works, we don't even know where to look. The brain's been dissected. Humans love the brain. I love the brain. And it's a really interesting thing. And all the parts of the brain are kind of accounted for and correlated to different functions. And none of those functions are tying together all of this sense data to make your experience. None of them, which is very interesting, by the way. If you think about that as much as the medical community knows, we don't even know where to look for how this ties together, for how your consciousness kind of manifests. So that's point 2, is that there's no neuroanatomical place where everything comes together. Point 3 is, your awareness and my awareness, right? You and I both feel homogeneous, kind of what I was saying earlier. But something interesting is that if you were to ask somebody, like if you were to ask me, and I'll pose this question to you now, do you feel like you have a body, or do you feel like you are your body? Are you your hands, or do you have hands? And, semantics aside, I feel is that I have a body. It's a tool that I am using. And so there's a kind of separation there between my consciousness or my awareness and my organism. And, obviously I don't know everything, but I don't see any way in which that's beneficial for the organism to have the driver of the animal, the driver of the boat, which is the consciousness, your awareness, your decision-making capabilities, to feel almost separate from the organism as opposed to homogeneous with the organism. And maybe you do feel homogeneous, and so maybe that point is null and void to you, but there are a lot of people, myself included, that feel like I have a body, not that I am a body. I feel like my personality isn't contingent on being in this body. I don't know how to switch bodies, but I feel like you could take my mind, my consciousness, my personality, my perceptions, and dump them in another organism, and I'm still totally me, because I personally identify way more with the mind, the consciousness, the brain, than the individual body. Like if I were to cut my hand off, I'm not losing that much of my personality. It's probably really painful, and I'm losing a great tool, but there's a separation there. And so that's another just point of information, an interesting point of information. Another point of information. And so these are all, by the way, just different points that you should consider as a whole when I pose the theory. But another point would be the role of observation on an outcome, right? So Newtonian physics is great because it doesn't really care about the observer. And so we use that to explain a lot of the things around us that, Newtonian physics has been really, really beneficial for the human race because it's helped us explain so many things. But quantum, which by the way is an actual study of physics. So people that use quantum words and like Rick and Morty about the quantum carburetor and all this stuff, a lot of the time it is kind of comedic and it's poking fun at things and like playing with people that want to sound smart or whatever. But it's an actual study of physics, and it's an amazing, amazing study. It's the forefront of the physical community or the physics community right now, and definitely worth your time. But anyway, quantum physics does actually care about the observer. It does care about consciousness. It's trying to factor that in because I'll leave a link to something called the Double Slit Experiment and another one, to a really cool one called the Quantum Eraser Experiment, which shows that the presence of an observer, the presence of consciousness, totally affects the outcome, and it's not explainable with the Newtonian view of physics. And so the physics community, which tends to be the more straight-laced community, if you will, they're totally okay with this type of idea that consciousness plays more of a role, or is more of a holistic field, as opposed to generated by the mind. Okay, so that's just another point of information. And then I'm going to talk about some exceptions to the rule. So let's say, for example, for just a moment, that consciousness is generated by the mind. Well, there are exceptions to that rule that have existed and have existed for a long time. And although they're not common, exceptions to the rule break the rule, and it causes you to have to reconsider the rule. And so some of these exceptions would be out-of-body experiences, right? So a lot of people don't necessarily like this point of argument, but it's kind of undeniable that out-of-body experiences exist. If you've ever experienced with, psychedelics or intense meditation and breath work or trauma and surgery and stuff like that, out-of-body experiences have been reported through all times and all around the globe. And there's a quote that one of my partners uses a lot, and I really like the quote. It's, how many coincidences do you need before you feel the need to question the current narrative, to question a paradigm? And the reason I bring that up is because there are so many documents of these types of coincidences. And yes, a lot of them are probably hoaxes. A lot of them are probably cries for attention or something of that nature. But the highest percentage I've heard is 13% of, and this is interesting, so 13% of people that have severe degenerative brain disease, and that have totally lost their lucidity, regain their lucidity at the, you can think of it at the pinnacle of their degeneration, right? Because it's right near their deathbed, on their deathbed, whether that be, sometimes hours or days before they die, and in rare cases even weeks before they die, they regain a level of lucidity that's indicative of a fully functioning brain, even though that their brain is totally degenerated. And so, that's an exception to the rule. And I sincerely doubt, and again, I'm going to use this 13% figure, but let's just have it. Let's just say 5%. I sincerely doubt that 5% of the cases that, doctors and nurses work with and the families of these patients, 5% is a huge number. I sincerely doubt that they're all hoaxes, but let's just say they are. Another thing that occurs sometimes, which you can always call hoax. You can't prove with evidence this type of experience by calling somebody a liar. Sometimes if there's enough liars, then maybe there's shreds of truth sprinkled in there. But kids sometimes, especially in India for some reason, seem to be born with memories of past lives and vivid recollections of where things are. They help solve murders. They help solve where lost people are. That's an exception to the rule. And I'm not attempting to understand or say that I understand how this occurs, but these are exceptions to the rule that occur. And if the brain generates consciousness, that shouldn't be able to occur. But if it detects consciousness, then that makes much more sense, to be able to detect something that's ambient, that wasn't necessarily connected to your organism, that can help, that attunes, these individuals that have these kind of radical cases of memory and reincarnation or of out-of-body experience, like whether that be on a surgery table or whatnot. If they can detect it and it work just fine outside the body, then it implies that the brain is not needed at all for awareness and consciousness. It just is a detector of awareness and consciousness. In surgeries, in ER rooms and whatnot, they will paint the bottom of the room with sometimes a letter or an image or whatnot. And people that have never been conscious inside of the room, only unconscious inside of, the surgery room, have been able to tell, it said LOL, or it was a picture of a heart, or whatever it is. And so that's another example. Ego death is another example. So there's plenty of these examples sprinkled in that are exceptions to the rule that the brain generates consciousness, and that support that the brain or the consciousness is a field. One of the last points I'll make about this is your eyes don't generate light. They detect light. They interact with light. Your ears don't generate sound. They detect sound. They interact with sound. There's no medical evidence that says your brain generates consciousness or generates this model of awareness. And so, following the suit of the rest of the nervous system, it's likely that your brain detects awareness, detects consciousness. Now, awareness and consciousness seem like pretty similar topics, and so I want to kind of split them apart real quick. I don't know if anyone can define consciousness. Consciousness is a super slippery topic, and it's something that it's kind of inherently undefinable, I feel like. But if my best attempt would be that consciousness is the fractal awareness or of experience, of observance, or whatever that last word is along the same lines of awareness. And the reason I throw that word fractal in there is because, if you're aware that you're aware, well, now by default, you are aware that you are aware that you are aware. And that's like a fractal rabbit hole that I don't really think is kind of graspable. I don't think you can kind of end that grasping without the word fractal. But to me, that's the seed of consciousness. So it's like the fractal awareness of experience, of observance, of tying together, whether that be sense data or ideologies or mentalities or whatever it is. And anyway, so I bring this up because awareness is an extremely important quality there, but we have no medical reason to believe that awareness is generated by the brain. Even the brain is an interpreter, but it's a decentralized interpreter. And so there's this undeniable homogeneous quality to life. I feel like I have one thing that doesn't match up and correlate with the medical community. And so it begs the implication that awareness may not be local to the mind. It may be received or interpreted or attuned to by the mind. No idea how that would work, but I'm just following the logic of what has been observed. And so lastly, it benefits an organism not to be overwhelmed. It benefits an organism to be aware. And that's a very honest view. You're going to live longer and therefore, benefit your RNA's goal of self-replication more if you are aware. And the brain is really, really good at limiting awareness. There's, even though our snippets, and I may have talked about this earlier, I forgive if I'm repeating myself, but I want to pull another point in. There are snippets of information that, our sense data gives us. Although they are just snippets, there's still an amazing amount of information coming in. The heat you feel, your shirt, light, you're hearing sounds, and it's going to be like the first time every time, and that's not beneficial for you. It's not beneficial for you to be overwhelmed. You would be unable to really put your attention and focus and awareness towards the variables that really need your attention, like that predator over there or whatever, if you were caught up in what you were wearing, what you're breathing, what you're feeling all the time. And so in a way, we are conscious both in spite of and because of our brain. Our brain fosters a more holistic awareness because it cuts down all of the immediate, you can call it novelty sensation, that a lot of our data gives us. And in the fostering of that holistic awareness, by default almost, or by extension, we became aware of our own awareness, that abstraction, which it seems to me like the seed of this consciousness. And because we don't understand, and because there's no evidence supporting that the brain generates awareness or generates consciousness, I would make the argument that it follows the same suit as the rest of the nervous system as a detecting or translating agent. Your eyes translating the wavelengths that you see into an image, your ears translating and detecting the sound waves that you hear into what you view as sound, et cetera, than a generator of any sorts. Great. So if we can accept all those arguments, or if any of those arguments were the tipping point for you to be open to the idea that consciousness is a field, this is where the cool things start. So you could put a consciousness detector in the form of a brain in a spacesuit, right? And ship it to the other side of the universe, and that person would still be able to detect consciousness, right? So as long as the detector wasn't broken, they could detect consciousness, which is pretty cool. And that kind of implies that consciousness exists everywhere. It exists on Mars, it exists in your backyard, it exists on the other side of the universe, everywhere. And because it's a field, in a sense, the other four fields, the other four fundamental forces, which is gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak and strong interaction, they are considered fields because they pervade over all matter, all area, all existence. And consciousness, assuming this is a detector, which I believe is a detector, detecting or tuning into that field, exists everywhere too. And so this could be like a fifth fundamental force, which would be crazy cool in science. But one step past that, you could say, okay, let's say consciousness is a field. And you're trying to compare it to another field, like a radio wave or something. And you say, if I turn on a radio and I turn on a different radio and I tune to the same field of radio, I get the same exact thing. So why don't we all have the same awareness, same consciousness, whatever? And I would argue the same reason we all have different thumbprints, right? So everybody during their development has different inputs and different environments and stressors and whatnot. So in vitro, you have different ones, and then when you're developing, your prefrontal cortex is subjected to different life decisions, different environments, etc. And so because of that, nobody has the same neuronic structure and density and lack of density that I do or you do. And because of that, our radios are all different. If the brain acts like as a detector as a radio, mine attunes to, the consciousness, the personality, flavor of consciousness that is Jake, and yours may attune to does attune to yours. And so that's just a quick little snippet there. But lastly, and so I started this video off saying I'd make an argument that, the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but it rather detects it. And then I ended with that consciousness may be the only thing that exists. And I'm going to pose a question to you. So is it more likely and this is a hard question, and you have to come to an intuitive sense of your own, but is it more likely that the insane complexity that is the human brain developed from the outside in? And what I mean by that is, so you had the Big Bang and gluon plasma, and then the four fundamental forces I talked about, the 7 fundamental units, acting and interacting in a way that creates the environment for Earth, which creates the environment for geochemistry, for RNA, for competition, and then that competition goes through a series of environments, then gets molded into the complexity that is the human brain that generates consciousness, and I put that in quotations. So, because that's the outside-in kind of view, is that consciousness was a byproduct and generated by the interaction of physical reality. And so, humans today, with all of the complexity that we do understand, don't understand even close to that complexity. So that's a level of complexity that is just immensely high. So is it more likely that that complexity was developed from the outside in, or that consciousness is kind of the only thing, and in its magnificence, in its attempt to explain to itself the possibility of its own existence, which is a tendril of thought, just a tendril of consciousness, it created micro and macro environments that fit in logically and that follow a set series of, you can call it explanations, that no matter how deep you look or how big you look, there are rational explanations that help justify to itself the possibility of its own existence. I know that was quite a sentence, and I don't like necessarily like throwing those in next to each other, but is it more possible that consciousness kind of bends the rules and makes the explanations to the insane level of complexity that exists from the inside out, or that this level of complexity was attainable from the outside in via interaction? I don't have an answer. I would lean towards the inside out, but if you lean towards the outside in, that's totally fine. There's no intuitive way to do this, but I will leave you with one thought before you answer the question to you. And so that is, if you do buy into the Darwinist theory of evolution, and I think it's a great theory, have you ever wondered about the math? So the complexity that is like the human genome, or any animal's genome really, but let's just focus on you and I, is intensely amazing. I mean, the strings of RNA, like one cell of your DNA, if you were to unravel it, would be 6 feet tall. And you have anywhere between 25 trillion, 75 trillion cells in your body. That could go to the sun and back 700 times, 600 times, something like that. And mistakes almost never occur in replication. I mean, they do. And, you beat cancer every day. There are mistakes that happen every day. But based off of all of that information, it almost never occurs. And so that's how acute of a formula that is for the human genome, the human DNA sequence. And if you were to take the best end estimates of how often mutation occurs, right? And so you're ramping that up. And then, on terms of helpful versus harmful mutation, you just take the random, right? Because that's what the Darwinist theory kind of thinks about. And then you take the fastest end estimates of how often a beneficial trait can spread out to a population giving a certain lifespan. And then, you take the lowest end estimate of how many environments, stressors that need to exist or needed to have existed in order to forge out like humanity. And then, you take the highest number of environments possible in like 3.8 billion years. And so you just take the best end estimates of all of these bell curves, and you kind of calculate how long that random mutation should take to make the complexity that is, humanity. Well, intuition would beg, and this is not just my intuition, this is an arithmetic problem with Darwin's theory that we don't know how to reconcile. Intuition would beg that if mutation is random and helpful mutation occurs way less than harmful mutation, because mistakes almost always are bad and not good, that it should take way longer than the 3.8 billion years that it's taken for the complexity of the human figure and the human DNA sequence and a lot of the other organisms in the world to have come around. And that implies one of two kind of adjustments to the theory. Either life came to Earth already a little complex and continued complexifying, which I have no reason to believe, but that is one possible avenue and interpretation, or that there's some type of helpful mutation attracting agent that affects mistakes, affects replication, and fosters better interactors with reality. And ultimately, it seems that consciousness is being fostered. So it's just something to consider with the question. And then I know I said this twice, but I think one last thing I'll leave you guys off with is so if consciousness is a field and you are an expression or an attunement of consciousness, that means that one consciousness, which is a topic that's brought up in a lot of religions and religious text or spiritual text, really kind of does exist. If it is just a field of awareness that mimics organization, because what the animal is really trying to do, what organisms in life are really trying to do, is create a tool of awareness that can have like a pre-adjusted manual for interaction, but really it's a model of organization, right? So gravity is a concept that almost every animal understands, because every animal, excluding a lot of marine animals, are subjected to it at times in their life. So it's something that's like innate, even though we call it different names, we experience it different ways, it's innate in our understanding or organizational model of reality, along with every other thing. Humans are interesting because we have language and we can borrow history, and so our model of organization is intensely detailed, and it's through experiments and through just history, etc. But at any rate, so if consciousness is this model of organization that the animal is kind of forcing your awareness to be present in, right? Because your awareness could be half the animal, half this field of consciousness. And consciousness is the tool that this intelligent tool of iterative evolution of life is using to create this model of organization. And consciousness and organization do have a tendril of connection. And the reason that that's so interesting, that's so cool, is that because organized reality is kind of a phenomena in itself. Have you ever asked yourself, why do things have to be organized? Why does there have to be, why does length and distance have to be connected? The concept of organization and interaction that's not inherently random, which seems more likely given if you had two scenarios, right? The unstable scenario or the stable scenario, or stable interaction versus unstable interaction. When by stable, I mean following a set series of organizational rules or not following a set series of organizational rules. There seems to be a physical requirement of a reason behind why there are rules to be followed. And if consciousness is a different way of interpreting organization, and organization is that set series of rules, then consciousness very well could be the organizational factor that created the environment of reality, because of how similar they are ethereally. And that could also be, consciousness could also be, the one consciousness could also be a pillar that pulls helpful mutation and pulls energy, right? Because all matter is condensed energy, and energy interacting is this another name for this organization towards that of consciousness itself, and it could just be this reverberating cycle. But yeah, I know that's a lot of words. I'm gonna end the video off with that. If you guys liked this, let me know. If you have any questions or you have anything that you want me to go into or an example or anything like that, let me know. And you can either do that by a comment or texting me, or any of the ways that you guys know me. Really happy I was able to make this video for you, and I hope you have a fantastic day. So take it easy.